I can ask you the question I was going to ask you before when I first came in the door. In addition to poetry, do you do anything else in terms of prose, fiction, or writing? Yes, Ms. Dema.
Nothing that anybody's going to read for at least a decade, but but yes, I write short stories for myself and for my 4-year-old nephew because he's, of course, an impartial judge. But no, nothing that's been published, nothing that's been read by more than 1 or 2 people. So I'm still, I suppose, working at the craft.
Thank you so much, both of you. So you're both women from Southern Africa, and I suppose what I'm wondering about, so I was in Gaborone this summer, very briefly, and what I've picked up very strongly is this antagonism towards South Africa, that Botswana is a much better place, because South Africa is the place of violence and terrible things, but Botswana is the place of kind of peace and haven where everybody gets along. So I suppose what I'm really wondering with the two of you, both women poets, what are the things that both divide and unite you in terms of who you are as poets? I don't know if you could reflect on that.
I love Botswanans. I wasn't aware specifically of that hostility, although I think many people from my fellow African countries have every right to be very distrustful of South Africa's commercial and political intentions. I think when one speaks at scales like countries and cultures and atmospheres, almost inevitably one would be able to say rather broad things. When we're thinking about when I first heard TJ read, or that very beautiful response you had to some poems that you heard, or Tsitsi's loving honoring of Patricia, I think that's much more likely to be the relationship at that scale. So yes, that's probably what I'd say. I'm sure I don't love all Botswanans, but I love this one.
Yes, it's difficult to say this is true, this is not true. Which individuals were you talking to? Why do they feel the way that they do? But as someone, I suppose, native to the space, that's not a sense I've gotten. If anything, I've gotten a sense of envy, for want of a better word, because South Africa has positioned itself, or we have accepted this idea that it is kind of the New York or the Berlin or the London. I don't even know if my references are the right references, but you get the idea, kind of the Hollywood for us, right? This is what the rappers do in Botswana. Any awards that you want to pick up, you kind of have to compete with South Africans on their turf. You move to Joburg. This is what we do. You leave our borders. It's not within our borders that you're trying to get to the city. You're actually trying to leave Botswana to go to South Africa. And I know that when I was starting out, that must have been in the back of my mind, because a lot of my initial readings outside of home were basically for a year and a half were happening in South Africa. And when I go back home, I've been invited back to South Africa, so just officially, we love each other. It's on record.
You both gave beautiful poetry, and it was a result of your upbringing in your different countries. Can you give a short sentence on the thing of your upbringing that most impacted you?
I wish I could say otherwise, but I think for me it's the English language. because on so many different levels, it was the language of instruction and academically speaking. And so when I began to read, that was kind of how that was my first foray into the world, was kind of English literature. And I'm grateful for that outside of the politics, because as well, if I can't speak German, my Portuguese is atrocious, but these works get translated into English because it's a kind of, whether we want it to be or not, it's this kind of universal tent that we can all kind of stand under, within and outside of the politics. So I suppose that definitely, because then whatever I read has kind of impacted my ideas of what poetry is and what I write, and so it kind of feeds. But hopefully I'll have a different response in 5 years. But yeah.
That is a very hard question. The first thing that occurs to me is that almost everybody in our house loved to read. And my father was also the person who looked after us primarily. My mother was the one who earned a living. And I would sometimes remember that there would be people in different rooms, and you'd know that they were reading because somebody would just guffaw with laughter, right? And what is she reading? And then you want to find out. So the fact that reading was just such an ordinary, pleasurable part of our lives, and not, I'm talking about pulp fiction here, detective stories, like everything that you truly love that you couldn't put down. I think that influenced me hugely. And I so hope that, when I see people reading on their screens, that's what they're doing. They're reading a detective novel or something. So just reading. That's what I remember.
I know that both of you are poets, but I remember watching the 60s and 70s and watching the devastation in South Africa. I remember watching Serafina, and I could hear by the foot stomping of the children that they were going to shoot the children down. Mm. And that so devastated me. And, I enjoyed the words, but I wanted to hear more about the country. And has it changed? And is what we think and what we heard, is it the real deal? So can I ask of you, just use words, just words to describe what's going on in the country.
I think that's an honest question, and you're right to ask that. In some ways, possibly that's why we're here. There's a reason that, say, I don't get invited to reading this as a Pennsylvanian poet, but I'm here as a South African, and so that's a legitimate question. I mean, in terms of the poetry doing that, I think our poems do various things. So I think of Tell Me What You See, for instance, as a poem about what is happening in South Africa at the moment. It's a fragile place, and what you have to do as a person who is part of a 20-year experience in justice, following a 350-year experience of injustice, is you have to understand fragility. You have to understand how to criticize without destroying or dismissing. So what is happening now is that, unfortunately, injustice continues, and the fight against injustice must therefore also continue. Those sites in the 1960s of people unarmed being shot are still happening, and sometimes it is shocking and devastating to see who's doing the shooting now. So what I will say is, it's the search for justice that is continuous between the period you're talking about and the period now, and that our responses to injustice have to be very careful so that we don't end up doing what I think has happened. One of the complaints your Botswanan friends had, for instance, was South Africa so violent. And in response, one of our police commissioners said, "That's it, criminals will no longer get away with murder. Shoot to kill." And we militarized our police force to try our best to fight criminal violence with another kind of just violence. But righteous violence is a blunt weapon, and as a result, unarmed people are being killed now by the police of a transformed and democratic South Africa. That is a devastating thing to have to say. But that is not the only part of the picture, of course. It's because governing is a difficult and challenging and messy business, and we as citizens of democratic countries have to hold our leaders to a better standard. So in some ways, it's almost easier to report about what is going well and what is going badly at the levels of leadership. I think the far more interesting question is, what are all of us doing as citizens to hold our government to better account? Here in your city, in my town, in my country, in South Africa, how am I asking the necessary questions so that my answer about the 1960s doesn't sound like my answer about the 2010s?
Your question was specifically about South Africa, no? Yeah, no, because I come from Botswana, I'm choosing not to add anything to what Gabeba has said. I can't really sort of speak to the situation on the ground because I pretty much fly in as a tourist. We were talking about this earlier, and that's a different experience. You've got money, you're in the hotel, they have to be nice to you. You buy what you buy, you walk around, you don't necessarily have to pay attention to sort of, the workings, the societal workings at that level, because in some way you're functioning outside of them, even though you appear to be part of the equation. So I couldn't really sort of say anything concrete. Yeah.
Maybe one last, or two questions, yes, but one and one.
Okay. Good evening. I wanted to ask, how do both of you, as poets and as thinkers and feelers overall, feel and perceive technology and science in your societies right now? Along with that question, I wanted to mention that historically, for example, a South African mathematician at MIT, who I knew, Seymour Papert, he developed or worked with the Logo language for helping children learn in unconventional ways with computer software. He wrote a book called Mindstorms and a couple other books, and he was a founder of artificial intelligence. And then currently there's Elon Musk, who graduated from Penn, and he's a South African as well, and he got his physics degree, and he also studied business here briefly. But my point is that these South Africans were scientists and technologists, and as poets, again, how do you perceive science and technology overall, culturally, in your society right now, or don't you not pay attention that much to science and technology as poets, as thinkers, as feelers?
Wow. I suspect this is not what you're looking for, but sort of the extent of where technology kind of intersects with poets or poetry in Botswana is just as simple as that. For us, we're only just beginning now. I mean, access to the internet is ridiculously expensive, right? So we're thinking about us and our craft and how we can work with this to further it. And we're excited at the idea of like Wi-Fi, the fact that you guys have Wi-Fi on the plane. I was like telling people, So we're just excited about the basic things. I'm oversimplifying things here, but just the fact that, you can now be on the internet and know in real time what's happening. Somebody can be streaming something like this where your favorite poet from halfway across the world is reading somewhere, and you're probably never going to meet this person in person, and that you can access them. So it's simply about technology at that level, just kind of access to the internet, just being able to tweet and all of that. And just to put Botswana in context, we gained independence, a strange phrase, from the United Kingdom in 1966. So we are coming up to our 50th year. And this was the situation at independence. The country is about the size of Texas or France. And we had 4 kilometers of road in the entire country. Like, I don't know what that is in miles. And basically, you know, that was it. It's what, 3 miles? 2.4. Yeah, 2.4 miles. That was it in the entire country 50 years ago. We didn't have a capital, we didn't have a city within our borders. So kind of, I think what I'm trying to say is that we are at the beginning in a literal sense. And our concern now is probably not high science, whatever that is, but rather it's kind of what can make bread? If I mix flour with water, will I get bread, and can we eat that for supper? So this will probably be a different conversation in 30, in 50 years. And again, access to the internet, blah, 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 means that people begin to be ambitious in different ways, in interesting ways, and it's fast forwarding the development. So the conversation, especially where the city is concerned, would be different 10 years, 50 years from now.
Okay, thanks.
I would say about South Africa, immediately after the political transformation, I think we invested a huge amount of authority and hope in the sciences. That didn't bear out so well. If you only invest your hopes in the sciences and in commerce, right? What I would love to see is more artists and scientists operating in the same space, learning one another's cultures, understanding one another's forms of creativity, so that you don't end up with science determining large social policies that affect all of us, but where the authority of science is a relatively recent social agreement. And we don't always want to cede our capacity to discuss as a society broadly the important decisions we make, say, about healthcare, for instance. This is not just a scientific decision. Or should we take the coal out of the ground because we have some of the largest reserves in the world, so it'll be cheap, but what will happen to our atmosphere? If these were only scientific decisions, they would be pretty simple, but nothing is simple. If it's simple, it's because we've failed to read the small print. So we made that mistake of over-investing in authority that we didn't discuss sufficiently. And this was not only science, but I'm responding, of course, to your question. So really, what now is happening is that when I say in the immediate 1994 era, a lot of money and at universities went into sciences, and humanities departments were really underfunded. Now the government of South Africa has invested more money than any government in the world in resuscitating the humanities. So internationally, this is South African research chairs, but funded at internationally competitive rates, so that we can invest those questions that affect all of us with answers from science and technology, but not abstracted from other forms of intelligence, including humanistic ones. So what I would love to see is let's poets and astronomers and astrophysicists and medical scientists operate in the same spaces. Why not a Kelly House where all of us hang out together, talk about our work, be inspired with one another, argue with one another, and yes, so that it's not reactive, so that 20 years later the government realizes, oops, yes, you can get a lot of authoritative people in the room, but they have no new ideas. So where do new ideas come from? Where does creativity come from? And that might come from sharing our intellectual cultures.
Very last question here on the front.
Yeah, I gather that a sense of place is in terms of where you're from and where you are now is important in how you express yourselves and your poetry. And I gathered from your bio that you now are permanently residing in State College, perhaps? And I'm not sure where you're permanently residing, but is it in Botswana?
In Botswana.
It is in Botswana. So you're both in a different place. I mean, in terms of the fact that you're still permanently, your permanent home is in Botswana, but your permanent home is in State College. And I'm just wondering how that impacts how you express yourself and the fact that you're still in your home place, in a sense, and you're in a place that's completely different and sort of far away from what you're originally from, and how that affected, how it impacts you.
Wow. Recently, and perhaps not so recently, there have been lots of conversations that have been centered around sort of competitions or efforts to try and publish African writers. And the question of what defines an African, who is an African, has come up over and over. Are you still African if you have been away from Africa for 10 and a half years? If you are first generation elsewhere because you were born there, but the food you're eating in your home is still, your mother, you know, maybe moved to the States at age 50, and so you're still eating Ethiopian food. She's still speaking to you in the language from back home, but are you really African? Because when you walk out the door, you know, you're engaging with this other world. I don't have an answer to any of those questions. I want to say that you are as African as you feel. But I understand that people are probably looking for more specificity than that. They're looking for a way to measure something that's immeasurable. Because to begin with, this term African is very broad. It encompasses, we were saying this earlier, like 1 billion people, X number of tens of thousands of languages, and you know, borders, different sovereign powers. A situation can be happening in Joburg, which is a 45-minute flight away from Botswana, and it's an entirely, it might as well be happening in Washington, D.C. for somebody in Gaborone. So, again, I'm not really answering your question, but I just kind of, I guess, wanted to add to it and then hang it on.
You always make it a difficult act to follow. Yes, I do live in State College. And State College, of course, is a different world to Philadelphia. I realize that. So perhaps part of your question is really about State College as a place. You know, when I lived in Cape Town for 30 years, it was a foreign place to me. It must be for anybody who is who is an artist of any kind. So I can always be in a foreign place wherever I'm living. And it turns out that it was in State College that I first started to write poetry. I didn't need to write poetry in my hometown, which was the foreign country of Cape Town. Elsewhere, it came about. So what does place mean then for sparking those kinds of losses and rediscoveries that becomes evident in writing? I think this must also be true for all of you here. When I say I lived in the same room, actually, in the same house for 28 years. So here I found almost everybody is much more mobile. So where is the place that is your home? Is it where you're paying your rent right now? Is it the place you long for? Is it where your mother and your grandmother lives? You know, those are questions that are as complex probably for all of us as they are for African writers. The difficulty of having to be authentically African is the thing that limits, you know, that very interesting question. Not that you were asking it in an uninteresting way, but the State College part of it intrigued me. You repeated State College. State College. Tsitsi, do consider coming to live with us. It's really quite a fine little town.
I wasn't mean to criticize.
Yes.
I was born in a small town. So.
Yes. So I think the question is about using place always as an expansive experience, right? When I was in my my one room in my house for 28 years in Cape Town, there was a part of me that didn't understand Cape Town as much as I did once I started to leave it and started to come back and started to long for it. So some of my writing actually reflects that, for which I'm grateful. But of course, it's beyond writing. It's a very human question now in a world where some of us are forced to move and many of us choose to move, and some of us don't have a choice at all. So what is the meaning of place? I think that's a rather wonderful question. Yeah, so I'll probably go on thinking about it.